if psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird.
From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville with a couch full of summer interns, and we have a great show for you. Our trending topic today is the psychology of pride. We're going to meet our Charlotte panel first. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is back with us. Emma Kate, welcome back.
Thank you.
It's good to have you
Excited
back.
to be here.
Since we're going to talk about pride, do you have a favorite member of the LGBTQ community who's either a personality, a performer, or even a film or television series or show that really stands out for you that celebrates that community?
Absolutely. I really love Ellen DeGeneres. I've always thought she was hilarious. I loved her in Finding Nemo, and she is just a lovely human, and I enjoy her dancing. I think I've talked about that before.
You enjoy her dancing?
Yes.
Well, Dr. Frank Gaskell's with us. And Frank, how about for you? Do you have a favorite either personality, performer, or movie, television show that celebrates the LGBTQ community?
You should be able to guess this immediately. Who is it? This is easy.
When you say it, I'm sure I'm going to know.
Oh my.
Oh,
George Takei.
George Takei.
Oh my.
Oh my. Yes. We love George Takei. Very funny. And by the way, he's in something new.
It's his Japanese internment play.
That's it. But it's a movie now too, right? In their film?
It is being a movie. Yep. It's pretty awesome. And he's back on the show too.
Awesome.
Back on Howard Stern.
You said it.
Ooh.
One. Okay, just one.
For context, we only allow Dr. Gaskell, Frank, to say or reference Howard Stern 3 times a day.
Right. Not just on the podcast, but in life.
in life.
Right.
And if I hit 4, I get waxed.
Correct.
Yes.
Which has only happened once.
And Jonathan Hedderly's with us. He's our certified Asian who rounds out the panel. Jonathan, how about you? Any favorites that stand out?
Ezra Miller played a character named Patrick in The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and I really love that film and that performance and just how it's woven into the overall story of just being a teen and really not really questioning, but just navigating sexuality during that pivotal time and the friendship that he had with the other characters. I thought it was very, very tender and sensitive. So that's the first thing that came to mind for me.
When I saw that movie, I said that kid is going to be a rock star, and he has been. I mean, he is a pure shooter as an actor. He's outstanding. Well, each week, Jonathan trolls around the internet. He finds a great story of psychology in the news for our first segment that we call
Be Human.
So I have a question for everyone, but we're going to really start off with Frank. The question becomes, if you could travel back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self? Well, believe it or not, there is now a systematic study that explores the advice people would give to their younger selves. And this was reported in the Journal of Social Psychology, and the findings show that people's advice to their younger selves is overwhelmingly focused on prior relationships, educational opportunities, and personal worth. So most participants said that the advice they offered was also tied to a pivotal event in their past, such as a time they were bullied,
Born.
a relationship breakup, or an incident involving alcohol or drugs. And about half the time they had regret for what had happened. So Frank, if you could travel back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Put myself up for adoption.
Well, that is a choice.
Yeah. Like just put a sign out and say, $10, take me home. But, I mean, I'm not lying. Okay.
That's what makes it so
spin the roulette
funny.
wheel of parenting, I think I probably would have landed somewhere a little better.
But you turned out great.
but
You turned out great, Frank.
Yeah, right. But I think I would ask for a psychologist or go to the school counselor hourly.
Hour. It's like in between classes, like the break.
Yeah.
That's when you go see the counselor every time.
Will you be my mommy?
Are you asking me this question?
Sure.
I will not be your mommy, but
Okay.
I think
Thank you.
I think the advice I would give my younger self would be don't talk to Frank Gaskell. That would probably be
That would have been my advice to the younger Dave as well. Like turn left that pivotal moment when you turned right and you guys met.
See that kid you met in college that first day?
Yeah, right.
Just keep walking. Just walk
walk
go
on by.
past.
Right.
Just keep on going.
You know, I am relatively free of angst about my childhood, and the only thing that I can think of that I would tell my younger self is stick with a musical instrument. Like I played guitar for 2 years and then I gave it up, and now I really regret that I have no musical talent or ability, can't play a musical instrument, can't sing.
And that is so true. He has zero musical.
No, that is true. I mean,
talent.
that is.
I've gone
You are
to
tone
enough
deaf.
concerts with you to realize, like, wow, what's that sound coming from the guy next to me?
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, I don't. I try not to think about this too much, but I don't really feel like I have the regret gene in my brain. I don't lament a lot of things in the past. I do think that knowing now, like how much, how infrequent I've seen my brother and my dad, I might have not taken for granted as much of that social interaction, that time together. But again, that wasn't completely my decision, or like I didn't have control over that. But in terms of like things that I've done or didn't do, like, regrets is for Frank.
Regrets are for Frank.
I'm working on that.
Yeah. I don't think I would say I'm similarly. I don't have a lot of regrets because I learned a lot of things. And I think I would take a similar path to Jonathan and actually just give myself some advice about quality time and trying to live in the present moment and not care as much about what people think or say.
Now, I know this is a little off topic, so I'm going to say this very quickly before we shift to our trending topic. But Frank's talking about I would put myself up for adoption. I am adopted.
Me too.
But my dad is also adopted. He is one of 3 boys. And when he was really young, about age 3, his parents decided we don't want to be parents anymore. So they gave up their 3 boys to like a family friend, but they all lived in the same town. So
That's
he
insane.
grew up bumping into his birth parents and just constantly being reminded that like my parents didn't want to raise us because it like cost too much to keep buying shoes for children.
Wow.
I didn't know this.
That's a crazy
So,
story.
Frank,
I did not know that.
you know, Frank, when you think about like, could things be worse? You know, there are some stories that are genuinely horrific that are not your
Yeah,
experiences.
it's true. That's true. Thanks for building me up there, Heatherly.
Way to go. Well, if you have thoughts about that, we'd love to hear from you. You can write us at feedback@shrinktank.com and drop us a note, or you can send us a tweet on the tweeter box,
Oh my God.
@shrink_tank.
Wow.
If you could send a Western Union about your thoughts and comments, we would love to hear from you.
Well, let's move on to our trending topic. We're going to talk about Pride Month, the month of June. We're toward the end of it, but we want to talk about this month and the significance of it. And for those of you who don't know, Pride Month is a month where we celebrate the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer community, plus all the other sexual orientations and genders. It features marches around the country, educational and awareness events, and parties to celebrate LGBTQ pride. And I want to, before we kind of dive deep into that, I want to say over the past decade or decade and a half or so, we've really seen a lot of role models within that community emerge. We've seen folks in television, film, music, on YouTube, in social media. So you already mentioned Ellen. We talked about Neil Patrick Harris, Anderson Cooper, Ellen Page. On YouTube, Tyler Oakley. among others, in sports, Gus Kenworthy, among others, Troye Sivan, Keke Palmer, and so on. We've really seen a lot of positive role models emerge especially in the last decade. Emma Kate, do you think that is a significant development within the LGBTQ community in terms of people who have platforms and who are in prominent positions coming out? And what do you think the impact of that is on that community?
Oh, I think it's a huge factor. And I think the impact is massive. When, the first experience I ever had with anything remotely related to this community was when I went to see Rent on Broadway. And I was in the 5th grade. I had no idea what AIDS was. And I was just kind of like, oh, cool, these two people love each other. What's the big deal? And I think as generations have gotten older, as social media has gotten, to be this pervasive thing, we have an opportunity to make contact with people and individuals from different communities and cultures. And it really does provide a different lens to view them through and say, oh, well, even though they're different from me, we're the same. We're all people.
So, Frank, you and I are the oldest on this panel, I being the oldest of the oldest. And,
Yes.
And there is a generational difference between people of our generation and even the generation ahead of us, older than us, and current generations. How would you say that you've evolved yourself in terms of understanding, thinking about the LGBTQ community? Like, what? Give us a little sense of how that your awareness and how that's evolved for you.
So my brain was steeped in the conservative Christian ideology from the age of about 17 to 21, 22, just college really. And it was just, it's a sin. That's all there is to it. And I thought, well, okay, I guess so. And then there wasn't like a specific point, but I think it was just getting to know people who identified as gay and really questioning sort of the dogmatic way of thinking about things and looking at Christ a lot differently than the way he was portrayed to me, of more like loving, accepting, this is just who you are, it's your identity. And it's really helped me in therapy as well, of kind of being fine talking about it. I used to like, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about it, but it's a regular conversation for several of my clients, and I feel like I've come to a very evolved space, especially when working with and hanging out with a transgender person. It's just a whole different ballgame for me.
So bouncing off what Frank was saying, Jonathan, you went to a seminary. You've been a youth pastor.
That is true, David.
Yes, you have had a lot of experience in Christian ministry. How have you thought about this? You're thinking about the LGBTQ community evolved over years, and if so, what's that look like?
Well, I think it has to evolve. It has to have evolved in me. But what I will say is that there's kind of a little bit of a paradox within me, because on the one hand, as you all know, I have opinions about everything.
No.
Right? Shocker?
Shocker.
True.
But the other thing that's maybe paradoxical is that there's actually a lot of things that I just don't get riled up about. Like, I don't see what the big deal is. And so during my upbringing, which I grew up in a predominantly conservative household, and then I went into ministry at a church that was more moderate or liberal, at least from what people generally think about in terms of American Christianity, that they had a much more open policy and perspective on homosexuality, but not everybody felt that way. And I've always just been really perplexed by American theology and perspective when it comes to sexuality or homosexuality, like the puritanical shadows of American piety. I've never understood why it's this subject matter that gets grown old white men their panties in a wad.
Well, and I want to add to that. If I had stayed in sort of that circle from college, I don't know that my views would have necessarily changed a whole lot. And so it's more of who have I surrounded myself with in terms of friends, colleagues, being open to new ways of thinking. And I think the whole country is just following suit because old white guys are dying out. And that's what needs to happen.
Well, and I don't want to just bag on the establishment or the powers.
Bag on? What is
to bag on them? Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Bag
but
on.
I do want to say that having kids and having a perspective that didn't grow up in my environment, and to also get that perspective of like, what is the big deal with you all? Why is this so important to you? Adds a level of perspective, because I can't change the environment that I grew up in. I have the ability to kind of learn and grow and hear other perspectives and see how it may have informed me. But my daughters who have not grown up in that type of environment, they have not grown up in a predominantly conservative home environment, I grew up in a fundamentalist church. Women weren't even allowed to like make an announcements, in some ways. Like they could probably sing the soprano part and that was it. So the idea of raising two daughters, having been in Christian ministry, being in a profession where we are bound to not judge and not bring in, our own personal belief system to influence others. Like it's I'd like to say it's challenged me, but mostly it's encouraged me to evolve and really reflect on what I've been exposed to.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that too. I mean, like Frank was mentioning with his personal story, we don't know what we don't know. And if we're not exposed to and encountering people from different backgrounds and cultures and perspectives, then we can't help but not know things. So the reality is now we are living in a time where we have access to so much information and we can connect with people all over the world. And again, we see we're all the same. We might be different in certain ways, but we're all human, we're all people, and we should be treated the same.
So let me bounce off the question that Jonathan posed. And he was like, growing up, I never really got why people were so, particularly in the Christian subculture, so obsessed with sex and sexuality and so on. What is the psychology of that? Why is there such, in certain quarters still, and there is still, animosity toward gay people? Why is that? What's the psychology behind that?
I think it's, and we've discussed this in a prior episode, but conservative thinkers tend to be very black and white in their thinking. It's either this or this. And there's not a lot of nuance. They don't get humor the same way that liberals do. We covered that, I think, in the liberal. You see more comedians that are more liberal. But I think it's just very black and white. It's fear-based. You isolate yourself and your community to surround yourself only with like-minded people.
And I think it's even less than just being a conservative or a liberal. It's just the type of mindset that you have about your beliefs. If you are truly entrenched in a certain ideal, then when there is evidence to the contrary of that, you're going to clench down on that belief and say, no, I don't think so. And it pushes you and swings you even further towards your perspective and strengthens that belief. So,
and we see this not just in Christianity or American Christianity. You tend to see this in religious thought. I mean, by its DNA and infrastructure, religious belief is heavily rooted in orthodoxy and conservatism. It's really about this mindset of we need to preserve how things were in the past, because the closer things were in the past, the closer they're directly tied into the original essence of what that theology or belief is, where by very definition, progressiveness is that understanding that we can evolve and progress through life experience and through human evolution. So that idea of like, don't be shackled by the way things have always been. And that creates this tension with religious belief, this idea of circle the wagons or kids these days, or I long for the good old days of racism, sexism, classism, all those other arenas, but they lump it all together as in we're losing, the further removed we get from orthodoxy, the more we're losing grasp of the true meaning of whatever that religious belief is. But I also think just straight up, the Puritans, there is something about coming over in a boat to America, and it's just like, sex is so awesome, but it's scary, and it's the devil's opioid, and there's just something so absurd about how we as a culture are so hyper sensitive and triggered by sex, and then you add these extra dimensions of like the idea that a man has sexual feelings for another man or a woman has sexual feelings for another woman. You see people lose their minds.
And I have to add to that, there's this layer within at least our culture in America, based on probably some of the Puritan beliefs that pleasure is bad. We're supposed to repent for our sins and suffer. Right, Frank is he's there. But outside of religion, I think it is important to break it down and go a little deeper than that, in the sense that at a basic foundational level, humans fear the unknown and uncertainty and things that are different. And so that is ingrained in us from a survival perspective, where we want to stay with our in-group, the people that we associate with and what we know, and avoid or potentially fight the things that are outside of that. So
I referenced this in a previous podcast, but there's a study that I wrote about there's a new book out called The Psychology of Black Panther, or Black Panther Psychology, and I wrote a chapter about it, and it's about why people react, even if they don't express or are aware of overtly racist attitudes, they have reactions to people of different races that are negative. And there was a guy at Yale that did this study where he would show patterns. And so the pattern might be a row of circles all in order, or triangles. And then he would show a broken pattern where it would have the row and then there would be a piece of it that would be missing or out of the row. And then he would measure how uncomfortable that made people. And he would correlate that with attitudes toward people who were different, whether that was racially different or different in any way. And he found there was a really strong correlation between those things. And his point with this, and I talked to him, I called him up and talked to him about the study for the article, for the chapter. And he said that piece was correlational. They actually now are moving toward data that they're going to publish soon that shows causation, and that there's not just a relationship, but maybe that there is a causation between people that feel discomfort around broken patterns and attitudes toward people that are different. And it all goes back to what Emma Kate's saying. It's fear-based, it's anxiety-based, it's discomfort. It's someone's different than me, and so it makes me feel uncomfortable. And then they start hanging all the cognitive stuff around it. Then it's sort of like, okay, I have this emotional reaction that I can't really explain, but now here's all the sort of the rationale for that, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's a lot to that. Let me ask about this. Let me give you a couple statistics and talk about the role of families, the role of allies. But here are a couple statistics. This is why we're talking about this and why it's important. And by the way, it's the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And if you don't know what that is, 50 years ago in Greenwich Village in New York, there was a bar called the Stonewall Inn. It was a gay bar. It was mob run. And the police would go in and rough people up who were gay. And one night, some of the patrons pushed back It sparked riots, and the riots went on for multiple nights. It wasn't one event. It was multiple nights. And that is widely considered to be the beginning of the gay rights movement in the U.S. So we're at the 50th anniversary of that. But here in 2019, here's what we know. 43% of kids, so we'll talk teenagers on down, who are in the LGBTQ community, consider suicide. 43% compared to 15% who are straight. 38% gay kids make an actual plan to kill themselves compared to 12%, and 29% actually make an attempt, almost 1 in 3 compared to only 6% in the straight community. Now, with that, kids in the LGBTQ community who are in families that are rejecting are 8 times more likely to commit or to attempt suicide than those LGBTQ kids that are in accepting families. They're 6 times more likely to be depressed. They're 3 times more likely to use drugs. They're 3 times more likely to get STD. And last thing, 92% of LGBTQ kids in extremely accepting families believe that they have a chance of being happy and productive, compared to only 35% of those kids who are in non-accepting families. So the role of families is huge. So let me ask you, from your experience with that, we are both in southern states that often, or conservative areas that often we see kids that are wrestling with whether to come out or not, and whether their families will be accepting or not. Talk a little bit about your experience with the importance of families in this journey, especially for teens and kids. Emma Kate.
I feel like it's obvious that we cannot pick what family and circumstances we're born into.
As Frank will attest to.
Right. Hence his desire for adoption. But I do have to comment that when I work with individuals kind of struggling with their sexuality, their identity, how parents are going to react, how friends will react, it's really about shifting their attention and focus on the fact that they can't control what other people are going to feel or think about it. And it's approaching what matters to them and living their life in alignment with that, because there are always going to be things that will conflict with our choices, our actions. And if you feel like you're living the best life you can, that's truly all you can do. But you can't minimize the discomfort. You can't minimize the suffering. You still have to allow it. So it's a really tough situation. And it is hard for me when I have situations like that, because I just wish so desperately that we could make other people change and that we could help people be more open and tolerant. And that's something that we just have to figure out.
Frank?
I mean, what you're saying matches up with all the data that I experience in therapy. But it's always just shocking to me when a family says, well, I was referred here by my pastor to see you. And
that shocks me too.
Right.
I know, right?
It shocks me when anybody says I was referred to see you.
I know.
So
yeah, I know.
Just in general.
Yeah. And they say, let me ask you about your spiritual beliefs.
Oh, I thought they were going to ask you about your sexuality.
And then I go like, okay, I know where this is going. And a parent who just sits right there and says, well, no matter what anybody says, homosexuality is a sin, and no one shall enter the kingdom of heaven who is gay. And then I'm like, so we're going to talk to your 16-year-old kid about how you love and accept him, and you're telling him he's going to go to hell. Like, how can you reconcile that as a parent, other than it's just so ingrained in you? And those kids are terrified. They repress it and repress it and repress it.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
I mean, yeah, what Frank's talking about, that whole love the sinner, hate the sin, it's like, well, if you're still using the term sin, you're really sending a subtle message towards your child. But I also want to expand this beyond just conservative Christian ideology. I've worked with a number of parents that are very open-minded, moderate, or even liberal, but they're having a difficult time reconciling that their child has come out or identified anything other than straight, heterosexual.
And often there's a lot of reasons, but often it's because they worry that their life will be difficult. That's usually the thing that I hear.
Yeah, there's two main things that I often experience.
Or that there won't be grandkids.
Well, one is they really worry that their life is going to be immensely more difficult and challenging with struggles or discrimination. But the other is that they really have to shift their mindset because they start thinking about all these milestones in life that they assumed were going to play out in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And that is really an element of letting go, or even in grieving in the sense of like nobody's at fault. But yeah, maybe you envisioned your child's life and then your role maybe as a grandparent or a parent of looking this way. But we usually don't even sort of map out an alternative. We just like hit the pause button and say, listen, your thoughts and your worries are going so far down the road, and it really is about anchoring them with empathy. Like your kid probably knows that, and they knew that this was not going to be easy, but they decided to face you and disclose this. What do you think they're feeling right now, and what do you think they need from their parent more than anything else in the world right now? They need to be reminded almost by the minute that you love them, that you're proud of them, that this was tremendously brave of them, and that together you guys are you're gonna face whatever comes your way. And that, the more open-minded parents, that they respond well to that. They just, in that moment of like disorientation, they need that anchor to remind them, oh yeah, you're right, I'm a loving parent. This is really more about them. It's not about me and my emotions right now.
Let's wrap this up with a final question, and that is, Pride Month is about awareness, education, but also pride. It's also about ways that allies can support. So I'm sure we have listeners who are gay who are listening. I'm also sure that we have lots of straight listeners. Let's give some thoughts about how our straight listeners can be good allies to this community. Emma Kate?
So I think the first thing is to try to educate yourself. So, I think technically it's more appropriate to say LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus. And
by the way,
or cisgender.
I will say about that in any civil rights movement, there's a whole lot of early wrestling with language, and it's right now it's very clunky. It's this long acronym. We don't know where that'll be in 20 years, but right now that's kind of we take it where it is.
Mm-hmm. So, but doing what you can to educate and to show your open-mindedness is critical, and be willing to talk, even though it might make you uncomfortable, because the only way that any of us can make a positive and healthy change is to face that and to move through those emotions and those feelings. And, confronting our own potential prejudice or biases that are either conscious or unconscious. We do things all the time without even realizing it. And it's not intentional. It's not meant to be hurtful and spiteful, but just trying to build our awareness is really, really important.
Any thoughts, Frank?
I can't add anything to that. It was well said.
Jonathan?
Yeah, it's beautiful. The one other thing I would encourage people, in addition to just listen and be educated, is get involved and immerse yourself in that community. Because the more that something like pride or sexuality is detached, the more you don't really put a face to it, you open yourself to dehumanizing it and making it an issue rather than people. These are people's lives we're talking about. It's not a subject matter. It's not a tag or a hashtag. So the more you can put faces and people to this, then the more I think you really open yourself up for empathy and compassion and advocacy and support.
Good words.
And I'd like to piggyback on that real quick. If you see your friends that are in this community struggling, you have got to stand up for them. You have got to be with them and walk that path with them.
Good last words. If you have thoughts about this, we'd love to hear from you. You can write us at feedback@shrinktank.com or tweet us at @shrink_tank. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank podcast. If you like this episode, we hope that you'll give us a good rating on iTunes and tell all your friends to subscribe. And if you didn't like it, you can tell us why by sending us an email, feedback@shrinktank.com. For more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture, visit shrinktank.com for great articles and videos. And for links to some of our recommendations and doctor's orders products, you can see the description box in the show notes of this video. You can follow us on Twitter @shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we'd love for you to subscribe. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, so check out the description box below. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. Our marketing intern is Sarah Bradley. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hedderly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tune in next week for our discussion of the Shrink Next Door podcast. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.